I was sitting in the back seat of David's car watching my house, the home I'd lived in for 52 years, disappear in the side mirror when I realized my own children were abandoning me. We just pulled away from the driveway, my belongings crammed into 3 suitcases in the trunk, and David was talking to Claire on speakerphone about getting the house appraised quickly while I sat there like a piece of furniture being relocated. The real estate agent says we should list it next week. Claire's voice crackled through the speakers. We can't wait, David. The market's good right now. Neither of them asked how I felt. Neither of them looked back at me, 78 years old, leaving behind every memory I'd ever made with their father, every room where I'd raised them, loved them, sacrificed for them. They decided I was too old, too fragile, too much trouble to care for. And now I was being driven an hour away to Sunset Meadows, the cheapest nursing home they could find, while they planned how to divide up everything I'd spent a lifetime building. You need to understand something before I tell you the rest. I never imagined my life would come to this. Never thought my own flesh and blood would look at me and see nothing but an inconvenience standing between them and their inheritance. But that's exactly what happened. And I want to share this story with you because maybe you need to hear it. Maybe you're afraid of the same thing happening to you. Or maybe you need to understand what greed can do to a family before it's too late to fix yours. My name is Margaret O'Connor, and I'm 78 years old now. I've lived through more than most people can imagine, raised 2 children mostly on my own while my husband Robert worked long hours building his accounting practice, volunteered at the children's charity in town for 43 years, buried my beloved husband 3 years ago after watching cancer take him piece by piece. I thought I'd earned some peace in my final years. I thought I'd earned my children's love, or at least their basic human decency. I was wrong. Let me take you back a bit, so you can understand how a mother ends up in the back seat of her son's car, being shipped off like unwanted baggage while her children plan to sell everything she holds dear. Robert and I bought our house in 1972, right after David was born. It was a modest 3-bedroom colonial on Maple Street, nothing fancy, but it had good bones and a big backyard where the kids could play. We poured everything we had into that house, painted every room ourselves, planted the garden that eventually won neighborhood awards, raised David and Claire within those walls, celebrated every Christmas and birthday and milestone there. That house wasn't just property. It was our life, our story, written in every creaky floorboard and every mark on the doorframe where we measured the kids' heights as they grew. After Robert died, the house became even more important to me. It was where I still felt him, you see. In the kitchen where we'd had our morning coffee together for almost 50 years. In the garden where he'd spent Sunday afternoons pruning his beloved rose bushes. In our bedroom where I could still catch the faint scent of his cologne in the closet. Leaving that house felt like leaving him all over again. But David and Claire had other ideas. It started about 6 months after the funeral, when the acute grief had settled into that dull, constant ache that never really goes away. David came over for dinner one Sunday, something he'd been doing less and less frequently, and he walked through the house with this appraising look I'd never seen before, running his hand along the banister, checking the windows, examining the condition of things like he was a buyer at an open house rather than my son in his childhood home. "Mom, this place is getting to be too much for you," he said over dessert, not even looking at me. "The stairs alone are a safety hazard at your age. And the maintenance, when's the last time you had the furnace serviced? The roof inspected?" I told him I managed just fine, that I had a handyman who helped with the heavy work, that I'd lived in that house for over half a century and knew every inch of it. But he shook his head with this patronizing smile that made my stomach turn. "You're not getting any younger, Mom. We need to think practically about your future." He said we, but what he meant was they, him and Claire, making decisions about my life without including me in the conversation. Claire was even more direct when she visited the following week. She walked through the house with a realtor's eye, mentally calculating square footage and market value. She'd always been the blunt one, the child who said what she meant and didn't bother with softness. I used to admire that quality. Now it felt like a weapon turned against me. "You're sitting on a goldmine here, Mom," she said, standing in the living room where she'd opened Christmas presents for 30 years. "This neighborhood's gotten really desirable. You could sell this place and live comfortably for the rest of your life in a nice facility. Wouldn't that be easier? No more worrying about maintenance, about cooking, about being alone if something happens." If something happens. They were both obsessed with that phrase, painting pictures of me falling down the stairs or having a stroke with no one to help, lying there for days until someone found me. They made my continued independence sound like a ticking time bomb, rather than a choice I was entitled to make. I told Claire the same thing I told David. I wasn't ready to leave my home. I was healthy, active, still volunteering at the children's charity twice a week. I had friends in the neighborhood, a life I'd built over decades. Why would I give that up to sit in some sterile facility surrounded by strangers? But they wouldn't let it go. The visits became interventions. The phone calls became lectures about responsibility and facing reality. They tag-teamed me, David with his concerned son routine and Claire with her no-nonsense facts and figures. They brought up every small thing. The time I forgot I'd already watered the garden and did it twice in one day, the grocery list I'd misplaced, the doctor's appointment I'd gotten confused about the date for. Normal things that happened to everyone became evidence of my declining competence in their narrative. What I didn't realize then but see so clearly now was that they weren't worried about my safety. They were worried about their inheritance. Robert had left everything to me, of course, the house, the savings, his life insurance. The will stated that upon my death, everything would be divided equally between David and Claire. But I wasn't dying fast enough for their liking, and the thought of all that money just sitting there, tied up in a house and accounts they couldn't access, was eating away at them. I started noticing other things too. Little comments that revealed what they were really thinking. David mentioning how much his mortgage was, how expensive private school was for his kids, how he'd had to put off some home renovations because money was tight. This from a man with a six-figure job in pharmaceutical sales. Claire talking about her investment plans, about opportunities she couldn't take advantage of because her capital was tied up in other things. About how unfair it was that she and her husband were working so hard while sitting on potential wealth they couldn't touch. They never said it directly, but the message was clear. I was in their way. My continued existence in that house, living off money they considered theirs, was an obstacle to the life they wanted to live. The real pressure started about 4 months ago. They teamed up, came over together on a Saturday afternoon with folders full of brochures for senior living facilities. Most were nice enough places, I suppose, with activities and nurses on staff and dining rooms where you ate with other residents. But they were all the same thing. Warehouses for old people who'd outlived their usefulness, places where you went to wait for death with strangers instead of living out your days in the home you'd built. I said no. I said it firmly, repeatedly, in every way I could. But David and Claire had made up their minds, and my opinion, my actual wishes about my own life, didn't seem to factor into their decision-making process. Then came the doctor's appointment. I should have known something was wrong when both David and Claire insisted on coming with me for a routine checkup. Dr. Harrison had been my physician for 20 years. He knew me, knew I was sharp and healthy for my age, knew I managed my own medications and appointments without issue. But at that appointment, with my children sitting there like prosecuting attorneys, they painted a very different picture. They talked over me, interrupted me, told the doctor about incidents I barely remembered, or that they'd exaggerated beyond all recognition. The time I'd called David by Robert's name, a simple slip of the tongue, became evidence of confusion. The grocery list I'd misplaced became proof I couldn't manage daily tasks. They made me sound like someone in advanced dementia rather than a 78-year-old woman who occasionally forgot small things like every human being does. Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable through the whole thing. He examined me, asked me questions directly, and concluded what he already knew: I was fine. Aging, yes, but competent and capable. But David and Claire had planted seeds of doubt, and I could see they weren't finished. The intervention came 2 weeks later. They showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning, and this time they brought reinforcements: Claire's husband Tom, David's wife Patricia, even Father Murphy from the church, though I could see he didn't really want to be there. They sat me down in my own living room and told me they'd already made the arrangements. I was moving to Sunset Meadows, a nursing facility about an hour away. They'd already paid the first month's fee, already scheduled the movers for the following week, already started the process of listing the house with a real estate agent. My entire life had been planned out without my input or consent, and now they were just informing me of decisions that had already been made. I tried to argue, tried to tell them I didn't want this, that I was capable of living independently, that they had no right to uproot me from my home. But they had answers for everything. The stairs were too dangerous. The house was too big. I needed supervision. What if something happened? They were doing this because they loved me, they said, because they wanted me safe and cared for. Lies. All lies wrapped in concern, but lies nonetheless. Father Murphy tried to soften it, saying that sometimes our children see things we can't see ourselves, that accepting help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. But even he looked troubled by how they'd gone about it, how they'd made all these arrangements without genuinely consulting me. I spent that night in my bedroom, Robert's photograph on the nightstand, and I cried harder than I'd cried since his funeral. Not just because I was being forced out of my home, but because of what it meant. My children, the babies I'd nursed and raised, the kids I'd sacrificed everything for. The adults I'd been so proud of, they didn't love me. Not really. They loved what I represented to them. Money, inheritance, assets they were eager to claim. But me, Margaret, the person, I was just an obstacle to be removed as efficiently as possible. That's when I remembered something I'd done 2 years earlier, something I'd almost forgotten about in the chaos and grief of Robert's death and its aftermath, something that was about to change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The day of the move was gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. David arrived early with a U-Haul truck he'd rented. Claire came shortly after with boxes and packing materials. They moved through my house like professional movers, efficient and detached, wrapping up my life in newspaper and bubble wrap. They decided what I could bring: clothes, some personal items, a few photographs, and what would go into storage or be sold with the house. I watched them pack up Robert's study, boxing up his books and papers like they were worthless junk rather than the work of his lifetime. I watched them take down the family photographs from the hallway, the visual history of our life together. I watched them empty the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, where I'd taught Claire to bake and David to make his father's favorite spaghetti sauce. They didn't ask what I wanted to keep. They told me what I was allowed to bring, and the rest would be dealt with. My whole life reduced to 3 suitcases and a small box of photographs, everything else deemed unnecessary for my new diminished existence. The drive to Sunset Meadows felt like a funeral procession. David drove, making small talk about traffic and weather, pointedly not discussing what was actually happening. Claire had stayed behind to meet with the real estate agent, couldn't even take time to see me settled before starting to cash in on my displacement. And that's when I heard it. That conversation on speakerphone, David and Claire discussing my house like it was already theirs, planning the sale, talking about splitting the proceeds. They'd put up with the hassle of moving me, and now they were ready to collect their reward. Sunset Meadows was exactly what you'd expect from the cheapest facility David and Claire could find that wouldn't look completely heartless on paper. The building was institutional and cold. All beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly. The carpets were worn, the furniture looked like it came from a hotel liquidation sale, and there was that smell, that particular combination of disinfectant, old food, and something else I couldn't quite identify but that smelled like giving up. My room was small. Very small. A bed, a dresser, a single window that looked out onto the parking lot, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbor's television and her conversations with visiting family members. This was where I was supposed to spend the rest of my days, in this tiny box while my children sold my real home and divided up the money. David helped me unpack with the guilty efficiency of someone who wanted to get the job done and leave. He hung my clothes in the narrow closet, put my photographs on the dresser, set up my few belongings. The whole process took less than an hour. 78 years of life reduced to 60 minutes of unpacking. When it was time for him to go, he hugged me briefly, told me he'd visit soon, said this was really for the best and I'd see that once I adjusted. Then he left and I was alone in that sterile little room, more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. I sat on the edge of the bed, harder and narrower than the one I'd slept in for 50 years, and I looked around at what my life had become. This was how my story was supposed to end. Warehoused in a cheap facility while my children sold everything I'd worked for. Waiting out my final days in this beige box surrounded by strangers who were paid minimum wage to pretend to care about me. But I had a secret. Something my children didn't know about. Something I'd set in motion 2 years ago when I first started noticing their growing entitlement and impatience. And sitting there in that depressing little room, I felt something unexpected. Not despair. Hope. Because David and Claire had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed I was just a foolish old woman, too sentimental and naive to see what they were really after. They'd assumed I'd go quietly, that I'd accept whatever they decided for me, that I'd be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. They'd assumed wrong. The first night at Sunset Meadows, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in that narrow bed listening to unfamiliar sounds, someone crying down the hall, the squeak of a medication cart making rounds, footsteps passing my door at odd hours, the constant hum of the fluorescent light in the hallway that bled under my door even after I turned off my lamp. Every sound reminded me I wasn't home, that I'd been exiled from the life I'd built, that my children had succeeded in putting me away like an unwanted piece of furniture they'd finally gotten around to storing. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and sat in the stiff vinyl chair by the window, looking out at the parking lot. The lights cast everything in a harsh orange glow. A few cars sat scattered across the asphalt, staff vehicles, I assumed, belonging to the overnight workers who checked on us periodically, making sure we were still breathing, still generating revenue for the facility. I thought about my bedroom at home, about the view from my window of the garden Robert and I had planted together, about waking up to birdsong instead of the mechanical sounds of institutional life. I wondered if the real estate agent had already put up the sign, if strangers were already walking through my house, opening my closets, judging my wallpaper, calculating what they'd tear out and renovate. I imagined David and Claire meeting with their lawyers, already counting money that hadn't been divided yet, planning what they'd do with their inheritance once the old lady finally had the decency to die. That thought should have broken me, should have sent me into despair. But instead, sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness of my prison cell, I felt something else stirring. Anger, yes, but also a cold, clear sense of purpose. Because I knew something they didn't know. And that knowledge was the only thing keeping me from complete despair. Let me tell you about what happened 2 years ago, right around the time I started noticing the changes in David and Claire. Robert had been gone about a year. The acute grief had faded into something more manageable, though I still reached for him in the night sometimes, still set out 2 coffee cups in the morning before remembering. I was learning to live alone, learning to be just Margaret instead of Robert's wife. And it was harder than I'd expected. The house felt enormous with just me in it. The silence was deafening. David and Claire were visiting regularly back then, checking on me, helping with tasks that felt overwhelming in those early months of widowhood. I thought they were being good children. I thought their concern was genuine, and maybe it was at first. But then I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. The way David would ask about my finances, about Robert's life insurance payout, about the house's value. Not out of concern for my security, but with this proprietary interest like he was already mentally calculating his share. The way Claire would make comments about how I should think about simplifying my life, selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, making things easier for everyone when the time comes. When the time comes. She said it so casually, like my death was an inconvenient scheduling conflict we needed to plan around. The way both of them would get impatient when I wanted to talk about their father, like my grief was tedious and self-indulgent rather than the natural process of mourning a 50-year marriage. They wanted me to move on quickly, get past it, make decisions about the future, meaning decisions about dividing up assets, without all this messy emotion getting in the way. I told myself I was being paranoid. That grief was making me see things that weren't there. That my children loved me and any concerns about money were just practical planning, not greed. But then came the lunch that changed everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd met my friend Helen for lunch at the cafe downtown, something we'd done every week for 20 years. Helen was a widow too, a few years older than me, sharp as a tack and unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. We'd gotten our salads and settled into our usual booth when she looked at me with those knowing eyes and asked how the children were treating me. I gave her the standard answer. They were wonderful, so attentive, helping me through this difficult time. But Helen just kept looking at me until I couldn't maintain the fiction anymore. They're hovering, I admitted, asking about money constantly, suggesting I sell the house, making me feel like I'm a burden they're managing rather than their mother they love. Helen nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she told me about her own children, about how after her husband died, they'd circled like vultures, pushing her to move into assisted living, to simplify her estate, to make everything easy for them to divide up when she passed. She'd resisted, held firm to her independence, but the pressure had been relentless. The worst part, Helen said, stirring her tea slowly, is realizing your children are capable of seeing you as nothing but an obstacle between them and money, that everything you sacrifice for them, all those years of putting their needs first, means nothing compared to their sense of entitlement to your estate. I wanted to argue to defend David and Claire, to insist they weren't like that. But I couldn't, because I'd seen the same thing Helen was describing. I just hadn't wanted to name it. Then Helen told me something that would change the course of my life. She told me about her lawyer, Richard Brennan, who specialized in estate planning for older clients. She told me how she'd rewritten her will after seeing her children's true colors, how she'd made sure her assets would go to causes she believed in rather than children who valued her bank account more than her person. She told me it had given her peace, knowing she'd taken back control of her legacy. You might want to talk to him, Helen said gently, just to review your options. Robert left everything to you and you have the right to decide what happens to it. You don't owe your children an inheritance, Margaret, especially if they're treating your life as an inconvenient delay to their payday. I thought about that conversation for weeks. Part of me resisted the idea. Wasn't I being unfair, judging my children for thoughts they might not even be having? Wasn't I letting grief and paranoia poison my relationship with them? But another part of me, the part that had been noticing all those little signs and comments, knew Helen was right. Something had shifted in David and Claire, and I needed to protect myself. So I made an appointment with Richard Brennan. His office was in an old building downtown, the kind with crown molding and hardwood floors and furniture that had been there for generations. Richard himself was probably 70, with white hair and gentle eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd heard every family story, every betrayal, every disappointment that money could cause. He didn't judge when I explained why I was there. He just listened. I told him about Robert's will, about how everything had come to me with the understanding that it would eventually pass to David and Claire equally. I told him about their increasing pressure, their comments about money and inheritance, their impatience with my grief and their eagerness for me to simplify my estate. I told him I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do, but I wanted to understand my options. Richard pulled out my existing will and walked me through it. The house, the savings, Robert's substantial life insurance policy, it was more than I'd realized actually, because Robert had been very good with investments and very careful about our future. Everything was set to be divided equally between David and Claire upon my death, with small bequests to a few charities. It was a straightforward, generous inheritance. The question, Richard said gently, is whether you believe this will honor your values and your wishes. Not Robert's wishes from years ago, but yours now based on who your children have shown themselves to be. That question sat heavy between us. Because the truth was, I didn't know anymore if David and Claire deserved the inheritance Robert had intended for them. Not because they'd done anything explicitly terrible, but because they'd shown me who they really were. They were adults who valued money over relationship, who saw their mother as an asset to be liquidated rather than a person to be cherished, who were already spending their inheritance in their minds while I was still alive and grieving. I need time to think, I told Richard. This feels like a huge decision. He nodded. Take all the time you need. But Margaret, I will say this. In my 40 years of practice, I've seen countless families torn apart by money. And almost always, the warning signs are there long before the death, long before the will is read. If your children are treating you poorly now, while you're alive and can still change things, imagine how they'll behave when you're gone and there's no one to hold them accountable. I went home that day with a folder full of information about estate planning options, about charitable trusts and foundations, about specific bequests versus residuary estates, about the legal requirements for changing a will, and making sure it couldn't be contested. I read it all carefully multiple times, letting the possibilities sink in. And then I started paying closer attention to David and Claire, watching how they interacted with me, listening to what they said and didn't say, noticing who they really were beneath the surface. What I saw over the next few months confirmed Helen's warnings and Richard's gentle suggestions. David called frequently, but almost every conversation turned to money. Did I need help managing my accounts? Had I thought about what would happen to the house when I was gone? Was I being smart about my investments? He never asked how I was feeling, if I was lonely, whether I missed his father. Just financial questions disguised as concern. Claire was more direct. She'd bring up estate planning unprompted, suggest I talk to a lawyer about getting my affairs in order, make comments about how much easier it would be for everyone if things were simplified now rather than later. She even suggested once that I might want to gift them money while I was alive for tax purposes so they could enjoy it sooner. The subtext was clear. Why make them wait for me to die when I could start distributing their inheritance now? Neither of them asked about my volunteer work at the children's charity, the thing that had given my life meaning for over 4 decades. Neither seemed interested in my friends, my activities, my actual life. They were interested in my death, in my assets, in expediting the process of turning me into money they could spend. 6 months after my initial consultation, I called Richard Brennan and made another appointment. I'm ready, I told him. I want to change my will. We spent 3 long sessions working out the details. Richard asked me about what mattered to me, what legacy I wanted to leave, who had truly been there for me in my life. And the answers surprised even me. The children's charity where I'd volunteered since David was in elementary school. That's where my heart was. The kids I'd read to, the families I'd helped, the programs I'd supported over decades. That work had brought me more joy than anything except Robert and raising my own children. Those children appreciated my time, my effort, my love in ways my own kids hadn't for years. My friends like Helen, who checked on me genuinely, who cared about me as a person rather than an inheritance. The church community that had supported me through Robert's death. The neighbors who still came by with casseroles and conversation, who valued my presence in the neighborhood. These were the people who treated me like I mattered. Not my own children, who'd grown up to see me as nothing but a future payday. So I made my decision. The new will would leave the bulk of my estate, the house, the savings, Robert's life insurance, to the children's charity I devoted so much of my life to. They would use it to expand their programs, help more families, create a lasting legacy in Robert's and my name. David and Claire would receive small personal bequests, some jewelry, family photographs, a few $1,000s each, but the major assets would go elsewhere. Are you absolutely certain? Richard asked me before we finalized the documents. This is a dramatic change, and it will likely cause significant conflict with your children. I thought about that parking lot conversation I'd overheard just hours ago. About David and Claire discussing selling my house before I'd even unpacked my suitcase at this facility. About their impatience, their greed, their complete disregard for my feelings or wishes. I'm certain, I said. Let them be angry. They've already shown me they don't value my presence in their lives. Why should I reward them with my assets when they've treated me like a burden? Richard prepared the new will with meticulous care, making sure it was ironclad, that it couldn't be contested on grounds of incompetence or undue influence. He had me evaluated by 2 different doctors who both confirmed I was of sound mind. He had witnesses who weren't beneficiaries. He documented everything to ensure that when the time came, my true wishes would be honored regardless of how David and Claire reacted. I signed the new will on a Tuesday afternoon, my hand shaking slightly but my resolve firm. Richard put the original in his office safe and gave me a copy to keep in my safety deposit box. Only he and I knew what it contained. David and Claire still thought they were inheriting everything equally, and I saw no reason to inform them otherwise. Let them think they were getting everything. Let them plan their spending, their investments, their future built on my death. The truth would come soon enough. That was 2 years ago. And in those 2 years, as David and Claire's treatment of me had gone from dismissive to outright cruel, as they pressured me to sell my home and move into this facility, as they'd made it crystal clear that I was nothing but an inconvenience to them, I'd never once regretted my decision. Now, sitting in this depressing room at Sunset Meadows, I thought about that while sitting in Richard's safe, about the surprise waiting for my children when they finally got what they'd been so eager for, about the justice that was coming slow and certain. The facility woke up around 6 with the sound of breakfast carts rattling down the hallways. A cheerful young aide knocked on my door and came in without waiting for an answer, immediately opening my curtains and flooding the room with harsh morning light. Good morning, Mrs. O'Connor. Time to get up. Breakfast is in 30 minutes. Her voice was aggressively perky, the way people talk to children or people they assume can't understand normal conversation. I wanted to tell her I'd been awake all night, that I didn't need her fake cheerfulness, that I was capable of getting myself up and dressed without assistance. But I didn't have the energy. So I just nodded and waited for her to leave before getting up and starting my first full day in captivity. Breakfast was in a large dining room with long tables where residents sat in assigned seats. I was placed at a table with 3 other women, all of whom seemed barely aware of their surroundings. One hummed tunelessly to herself. Another just stared at her oatmeal without eating. The third asked me repeatedly what my name was, forgetting the answer immediately each time I responded. This was my new social circle. This was what David and Claire thought was appropriate for me. A woman who'd been running charity events and managing budgets and living independently just days ago. They'd lumped me in with people who needed round-the-clock care because it was cheaper and more convenient than acknowledging I was still a capable person. The food was institutional: bland oatmeal, weak coffee, white toast that tasted like cardboard. I picked at it without appetite, looking around at the other residents. Some were engaged and alert, playing cards or reading newspapers, making the best of their situation. But many seemed to have simply given up, sitting passively while staff members talked over them and made all their decisions for them. I refused to become that. Refused to let this place strip me of my dignity along with my independence. After breakfast, there were activities. Bingo in the common room, a craft session where we made construction paper flowers like kindergartners, a movie in the afternoon that was so old I'd seen it in theaters on a date with Robert before we were married. I participated minimally, enough to avoid the staff asking if I was depressed or uncooperative, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the house, about whether it had sold yet, how much David and Claire were getting for it, whether they'd bothered to save anything meaningful for me or if they just cleared everything out as quickly as possible. I was thinking about my friends, about whether anyone had told them where I was, if they were wondering why I'd stopped showing up to volunteer at the charity or to our weekly lunch dates. I was thinking about Richard Brennan and the will sitting in his safe waiting. And I was thinking about revenge, though that's not quite the right word. Not revenge, justice. The natural consequences of David and Claire's choices finally catching up with them. The truth revealing itself in the most devastating way possible. I just had to wait. And waiting, it turned out, was the hardest part. Days blurred together at Sunset Meadows. The routine was numbing in its sameness: wake up, breakfast, activities, lunch, more activities, dinner, television, sleep. Or try to sleep, in that narrow bed in that small room with thin walls and harsh lighting. Each day felt like an eternity and also like nothing at all, time passing without meaning or purpose. David called once that first week, a brief conversation where he asked if I was settling in okay, if I had everything I needed. I wanted to scream at him that no, I didn't have what I needed. What I needed was my home and my life and my dignity back. But I just said I was fine, and he sounded relieved and quickly got off the phone. Claire didn't call at all. Neither of them visited, though the facility was only an hour away. Too busy, I suppose, dealing with selling my house and counting their money. I made friends with one other resident, a woman named Dorothy who was 82 and sharp as they come. She'd been put there by her nephew after her house burned down and she had nowhere else to go. Unlike me, she actually needed the care, had health issues that made living alone dangerous. But she still hated it, still felt like her independence had been stolen. The worst part, Dorothy told me one afternoon as we sat in the common room pretending to watch whatever bland program was on the television, is being invisible, being treated like we're already gone, like we're just bodies taking up space until we finally have the decency to die and free up the room for someone else. I knew exactly what she meant. The staff was polite but detached, going through the motions of care without any real connection. The other residents mostly ignored each other, lost in their own worlds of memory and regret. I was surrounded by people but completely alone. At night, in my narrow bed, I'd think about Robert, about what he'd say if he could see me now, warehoused in this facility while our children divided up our life's work. I thought he'd be heartbroken, angry, disappointed in the people David and Claire had become. But I also thought he'd understand what I'd done. The new will, the protection I'd put in place. Robert had been practical about money, careful about planning, always thinking ahead. He'd wanted to take care of our children, yes, but he'd also believed in consequences, in people earning what they received rather than simply being entitled to it. I held on to that thought like a lifeline, held on to the knowledge that soon, very soon, everything would change. 3 weeks into my stay at Sunset Meadows, Dorothy found me in the common room one morning, her face concerned. "Margaret, are you feeling all right? You look pale." I wasn't feeling well, actually. Had woken up dizzy, my heart doing strange things in my chest, my left arm tingling. But I'd ignored it, not wanting to make a fuss, not wanting to give the staff another reason to treat me like I was incapable. "I'm fine," I started to say. But then the room tilted sideways and Dorothy was shouting for help and there were people surrounding me and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. And my children were there, looking concerned and attentive and absolutely nothing like the people who dumped me in that facility and forgotten about me. Because now they thought I was dying. And dying meant will reading. And will reading meant finally getting their hands on everything they'd been waiting for. If only they knew. The hospital room was too bright. All white walls and beeping machines and that antiseptic smell that makes you feel sick even when you're not. I drifted in and out of consciousness for what might have been hours or days. Time lost all meaning in that fog of medication and exhaustion. But every time I opened my eyes, David or Claire was there, sitting in the visitor's chair with expressions of deep concern that I might have believed if I hadn't known better. The doctor told me I'd had a minor heart episode. Not a full heart attack, but a warning sign that my body was under stress. They wanted to keep me for observation, run some tests, make sure I was stable before releasing me. I nodded through the explanations, too tired to do much else, watching David and Claire exchange meaningful looks over my hospital bed. I knew what those looks meant. They thought this was it. They thought I was on my way out, that their long wait was finally coming to an end. And they were positioning themselves perfectly. The devoted children keeping vigil at their poor mother's bedside, making sure everyone saw how concerned they were, how attentive, how loving. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Claire stayed that first night, sitting in the chair by my bed with her laptop, occasionally looking up to ask if I needed anything in a voice dripping with false sweetness. I pretended to sleep so I wouldn't have to talk to her, but I watched through barely open eyes as she typed on her computer, probably emailing the real estate agent or her financial advisor or making plans for money she thought was about to be hers. David arrived early the next morning with coffee and croissants from the expensive cafe downtown, the kind of thoughtful gesture he hadn't made in years. He fussed over my pillows, asked the nurses if I was getting good care, made a show of being the concerned son for anyone who might be watching. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, pulling his chair close to my bed. "Tired," I said honestly. "Confused about what happened. You collapsed at that place." He said that place with such disdain, like Sunset Meadows wasn't the cheapest facility he could find to warehouse me in. The doctor said it was stress-related. Your heart can't take the strain of such a big change at your age. The irony was staggering. My heart couldn't take the strain of being ripped from my home and dumped in a nursing facility by my own children, but somehow he'd found a way to make even that not his fault. "We've been talking," Claire said, appearing in the doorway. "David and I. We think when you're released, you shouldn't go back to Sunset Meadows. Maybe somewhere closer to one of us, somewhere we can visit more easily. A nicer facility." Now they wanted a nicer facility. Now that they thought I was dying and wanted to make sure they looked good in the end. "We'll take care of everything," David assured me. "Don't worry about the cost. We want you to be comfortable. Don't worry about the cost." Easy to say when they thought they'd be getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from the sale of my house and estate any day now. I looked at my children, these two people I'd raised from infancy, changed their diapers and stayed up with them through fevers and driven them to soccer practice and helped with homework and sacrificed everything to give them good lives. And I felt nothing. No love, no anger. Just a cold emptiness where maternal affection used to be. They'd killed whatever remained of my love for them when they'd showed me so clearly that I was nothing but an inconvenience to them. "I'm tired," I said. "Can you both leave? I need to rest." They exchanged another look, concern mixed with something else. Impatience, maybe. Frustration that I wasn't cooperating with their performance of devoted children. But they left, and I was alone with the beeping machines and my thoughts. The third day in the hospital, something changed. I could feel it in the way David and Claire acted when they visited, a new energy, an eagerness they were trying to hide. They were whispering in the hallway outside my room, their voices low but excited. At one point, I heard Claire say something about finally getting this sorted out, and David responding with, "Let's not count anything yet." That evening, after the doctor told me I'd be released in a day or two, David came into my room alone. He pulled the chair close and took my hand with a gentleness that would have moved me if I didn't know it was completely fake. "Mom, we need to talk about some practical matters," he said. "I know this isn't pleasant, but with your health scare, we need to make sure everything is in order. Your will, your estate, all of that. Just in case. Just in case I died," he meant. Just in case this was their chance to finally cash in. "It's all taken care of," I said calmly. "Robert and I set everything up years ago with our lawyer." "Right, but that was a long time ago. Things change. We should probably review everything, make sure it still reflects your wishes. Make sure there are no surprises." No surprises. He wanted to make absolutely certain they were getting what they expected. "My lawyer has everything," I said. "Richard Brennan downtown. He's had my affairs in order for years." David's face brightened. "Brennan? I'll give him a call then just to touch base, make sure we're all on the same page about things." "You do that," I said, and closed my eyes to signal the conversation was over. I fell asleep with a small smile on my face, imagining David's phone call to Richard, imagining Richard's careful, professional responses that would reveal nothing but would set the stage for what was coming. They released me 2 days later with medication and instructions to take it easy, avoid stress, follow up with my regular doctor. David drove me back to Sunset Meadows in his car, and the silence between us was heavy with things unsaid. He didn't ask if I wanted to go back there. Didn't offer any alternatives despite Claire's promises at the hospital. He just dropped me off like he was returning a library book, helped me to my room, and left within 15 minutes. I sat on my narrow bed and looked around at my depressing little space, and I thought about how close we were now to the moment of truth. I could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. Dorothy found me an hour later, relieved to see me back. "We thought you died," she said bluntly, "when they took you out on that stretcher. That's usually how people leave here." "Not yet," I said. "I've got some unfinished business first." The call came 3 days later. Not to me, to David and Claire. I found out about it from Claire herself, who called my room at Sunset Meadows with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Mom, we've scheduled a meeting with your lawyer," she said. "Richard Brennan. He said there are some estate matters we need to discuss as a family, given your recent health issues. Can you be there Monday at 10? Estate matters we need to discuss as a family." Richard's careful language, giving nothing away but setting up the revelation perfectly. "I'll be there," I said. "Great. David and I will pick you up Monday morning." "This is good, Mom. We'll get everything sorted out and make sure you're protected." Protected? Sure. That's what they thought this meeting was about. I spent the weekend in a strange state of anticipation. Not nervous exactly. I knew what was in that will, knew Richard would handle everything professionally. But there was a certain tension in waiting for the moment when David and Claire's world would come crashing down around them. I thought about calling Richard to confirm details, but I didn't need to. He knew what he was doing. He'd warned me 2 years ago when I changed the will that this moment would come eventually, that my children would react badly, that I needed to be prepared for their anger. I told him then that I was prepared, that I'd made my peace with losing whatever remained of my relationship with them. Now, facing the actual moment, I found that was still true. I'd already lost them. Their greed and entitlement had taken my children from me long before this meeting would make it official. The will reading wouldn't destroy our relationship. It would simply reveal what had already been destroyed. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, matching my mood. David picked me up at Sunset Meadows at 9:30, Claire already in the passenger seat. Neither of them spoke much during the drive downtown. They were nervous, I realized, trying to hide it with small talk about traffic and the weather, but underneath it was this barely contained energy. They thought they were about to find out exactly how much they were inheriting, about to get confirmation that all their patience and sacrifices in dealing with me were about to pay off handsomely. Richard's office looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago, the same old furniture, the same sense of permanence and tradition, the same feeling that this was a place where serious matters were handled with appropriate gravity. His secretary showed us into the conference room, offered coffee that no one wanted, and left us to wait. David and Claire sat on one side of the long table. I sat on the other, facing them, with an empty chair beside me where Richard would sit. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, them together, aligned in their expectations and greed, and me alone on the other side. That's how it had been for years now. Why should today be any different? Richard entered at exactly 10 o'clock, carrying a folder that I knew contained the will that would change everything. He was calm and professional as always, greeting each of us by name, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone who'd done this many times before. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I know this is difficult to discuss, but given Margaret's recent health scare, I think it's important that we're all clear about her wishes regarding her estate." "Absolutely," David said, leaning forward. "We want to make sure everything is handled properly." "Of course," Richard said. He opened the folder and pulled out several copies of a document. "I have here Margaret's last will and testament, updated and executed 2 years ago. I'm going to review the main provisions with you now." I watched David and Claire's faces. They were trying to look solemn and appropriate, but I could see the anticipation in their eyes, the barely suppressed excitement. Richard began reading in his calm, professional voice. The opening sections were standard: establishing my identity, revoking all previous wills, naming Richard as executor. David and Claire listened politely, waiting for the important part, the distribution of assets section where they'd finally hear what they'd been waiting for. Then Richard got to it. "To my son David and my daughter Claire, I leave my personal jewelry, family photographs, and the sum of $5,000 each, in recognition of the fact that they are my children and deserve some acknowledgement in my final wishes." I watched the confusion spread across their faces. $5,000? That couldn't be right. That couldn't be everything. Richard continued reading, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "The remainder of my estate, including my home at 42 Maple Street, all savings and investment accounts, and the proceeds from my late husband's life insurance policy, I leave to the Children's Hope charity of this city, to be used for expanding their programs and services to families in need." The silence that followed was absolute. David and Claire sat frozen, their faces draining of color as the words sank in. $5,000 each. That was all. Everything else, the house they'd already mentally spent the proceeds from, the savings they'd been counting on, the life insurance they didn't even know existed, all going to charity. "There must be a mistake," David finally said, his voice strangled. "Mom, tell him there's been a mistake." I looked at my son, at the panic and disbelief in his eyes, and I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. "There's no mistake," I said quietly. "That's my will. That's what I want. You can't do this." Claire's voice rose sharply. "You can't just give away everything Dad worked for, everything that should be ours." "I can do exactly that," I said. "It's my estate, Claire. Mine, not yours." The conference room erupted into chaos. Claire shot out of her chair, her face twisted with fury, pointing at me like I was a criminal who'd stolen from her rather than a mother who'd simply chosen how to distribute her own assets. David sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his mind clearly racing through calculations that no longer added up to the windfall he'd been expecting. "This is insane," Claire shouted. "You're not thinking clearly. This proves you're not competent to make these decisions. We'll contest this. We'll have it overturned." Richard's voice cut through her hysteria like a knife. "Mrs. Patterson, I'd advise you to sit down and compose yourself. Your mother was evaluated by 2 independent physicians at the time this will was executed. She was found to be completely competent. There are no grounds for contesting this will." 2 years ago? David had found his voice finally, though it sounded hollow. "You changed your will 2 years ago and never told us? Why would I tell you?" I asked calmly. "It was my decision to make. My assets to distribute as I saw fit. But we're your children." Claire's voice cracked. "We deserve that inheritance. Dad would have wanted us to have it." "Your father wanted many things," I said quietly. "He wanted children who would love and respect their mother. He wanted a family built on more than greed and entitlement. He didn't get what he wanted either." The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. Robert would have been devastated to see what David and Claire had become, to know they'd valued money over their own mother's well-being. "This is because of the nursing home, isn't it?" David's voice was rising now too, anger replacing shock. "You're punishing us for making a practical decision about your care." Practical. I felt my own anger stirring now, the cold fury I'd been holding back for weeks. You put me in the cheapest facility you could find so you could sell my house faster. You made that decision without my input, against my wishes, and then abandoned me there. You didn't even visit once in 3 weeks, David. Not once. But you called my lawyer to ask about my estate. That was practical, was it? He had no answer to that. Neither did Claire, though she was still standing, her hands gripping the back of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. The house, Claire said suddenly. We already have it listed. We've been showing it. We have buyers interested. Under what authority? Richard asked sharply. The house is in Margaret's name. She never gave you permission to list it. She wasn't using it, David said defensively. She was in Sunset Meadows. The house was just sitting there empty. My house, I said. Still my house. Mine to sell or keep as I choose. Not yours to list and profit from. Richard pulled out another document from his folder. I've prepared papers to immediately remove the property from any unauthorized listing. Margaret, you'll need to sign here. I signed, my hand steady, while David and Claire watched in horror. Every stroke of the pen was another dream of theirs dying. Another plan crumbling. Furthermore, Richard continued, Margaret will be moving out of Sunset Meadows immediately. The Children's Hope Charity has already agreed to purchase her home and allow her to remain there as a life tenant, with full use of the property for the remainder of her days. Upon her death, the property will revert to the charity. You can't do this, Claire whispered. You can't just cut us out completely. I'm not cutting you out, I said. You'll receive $5,000 each in some personal items. That's more than you've earned with the way you've treated me. Earned? David's laugh was bitter. We're your children. We shouldn't have to earn our inheritance. Family doesn't work that way. You're right, I said quietly. Family doesn't work that way. Family is supposed to be about love and respect and caring for each other. But you two stopped treating me like family the moment your father died and I became nothing but an obstacle between you and money. You reduced me to an asset to be liquidated. Why should I reward that? The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier. More final. Because they knew I was right. Somewhere beneath their shock and anger, they knew exactly what they'd done, how they'd treated me, how they'd revealed their true priorities. What about the nursing home fees? Claire asked suddenly, looking up. Sunset Meadows isn't cheap. Who's paying for that? You are, I said simply. You put me there. You can pay for it. I have the bills right here. I pulled out the folder I'd brought with me, containing every invoice from Sunset Meadows. 3 weeks at $4,800 a week. That's $14,400. $7,200 each. We don't have that kind of money just lying around, David protested. Then you'll figure it out, I said. The same way you expected me to just figure out how to live in that horrible place while you sold my home. You made this choice. You deal with the consequences. This is vindictive, Claire said. This is cruel. No, I said, my voice steady and clear. Cruel is what you did to me. This is justice. Richard stood, signaling the meeting was over. I think we've covered everything that needs to be addressed today. David, Claire, if you have questions about the will, you're welcome to consult your own attorney. Though I assure you the document is ironclad. Margaret, I'll have the papers ready for you to sign regarding the property transfer within the week. David and Claire sat there for a moment longer, stunned into immobility. Then Claire stood abruptly, grabbed her purse and headed for the door without looking at me. David followed more slowly, pausing at the doorway to look back. I hope you're happy, Mom, he said, his voice cold. I hope this was worth destroying your family over. You destroyed this family, I said quietly. The day you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive. I'm just making sure you don't profit from that decision. He left without another word, and I sat in the conference room with Richard, listening to their footsteps echo down the hallway, then the slam of the outer door. Gone. Are you all right? Richard asked gently. I'm fine, I said, and realized it was true. I felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm free. Richard drove me back to Sunset Meadows, but this time I wasn't returning as a prisoner. I was just collecting my belongings before going home. The staff seemed confused when I told them I was checking out, That my children would be settling the bill. They asked if I had somewhere to go, if I had support, if I was sure this was safe. I'm going home, I said simply. To my own house. Where I should have been all along. I packed my 3 suitcases, the same ones I'd arrived with, and said goodbye to Dorothy, who was genuinely happy for me even though she looked sad to see me go. You give them hell, she said, hugging me tight. Show them what a strong woman looks like. I already did, I said. Now I'm just going to live my life. Martha picked me up. I'd called her from Richard's office, and she'd been thrilled to hear what had happened. She drove me home to Maple Street, and as we pulled up to the house, I felt tears in my eyes for the first time that day. Not sad tears. Relief. Joy. The feeling of coming back to myself after being lost for so long. The house looked exactly the same. The garden was a bit overgrown, but the roses Robert had planted were still blooming. The front door still stuck a little when you opened it. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. David and Claire hadn't had time to clear anything out before the sale fell through. I walked through the room slowly, touching familiar things, reacquainting myself with the space that held 50 years of memories. This was my home. Mine. And I was never leaving it again unless I chose to. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about what had happened. About the look on David and Claire's faces when they realized everything they'd counted on was gone. About the years of entitlement and greed that had led to this moment. About the choice I'd made 2 years ago that had finally come to fruition. My phone started ringing around 7. David. I let it go to voicemail. Then Claire called. Voicemail. They called throughout the evening, sometimes separately, sometimes one right after the other, a coordinated campaign to get me to answer, to reconsider, to undo what I'd done. I deleted every message without listening to them. Over the next few days, the calls continued. Messages left on my machine, voicemails on my cell phone, even an email from Claire's husband Tom trying to mediate. They wanted to talk, wanted me to reconsider, wanted another chance to explain why they deserved the inheritance after all. But I was done listening. Done being manipulated. Done being made to feel guilty for standing up for myself. The nursing home sent them the bill. I knew because Claire called screaming about it, her message angry and desperate. They couldn't afford it, she said. It wasn't fair. They'd been trying to help me. How could I do this to them? I felt nothing listening to her rage. No guilt, no regret, no urge to fix it for them. They'd made their choices. Now they could live with the consequences. A week after the will reading, the property transfer to Children's Hope Charity was finalized. I remained in my home as a life tenant, with all expenses covered by the charity in exchange for the eventual transfer of the property upon my death. It was perfect. I had security, they had a guaranteed bequest, and David and Claire had nothing but their own greed to keep them company. Ellen Morrison from the charity came to visit, bringing flowers and gratitude. We sat in my living room, the same room where David and Claire had pressured me to sell, to move, to give up my life, and we talked about the programs my gift would fund, the children who would be helped, the families who would find support, the legacy that would outlive me. You've changed so many lives, Margaret, Ellen said, tears in her eyes. Not just through this gift, but through all the years you've volunteered with us. You've made a real difference. That's what I wanted. Not my name on a tombstone with children who resented having to visit it, but real impact in the world. Real help for real people. A legacy worth leaving. The first month back in my own home felt like waking up from a long, suffocating nightmare. I moved through the room slowly at first, relearning the rhythms of my own life, the simple pleasure of making coffee in my own kitchen, sleeping in my own bed, sitting in my garden without asking anyone's permission or worrying about violating some institutional schedule. Freedom, I discovered, tastes sweetest when you've had it taken away and fought to get it back. Martha came over almost daily those first few weeks, bringing groceries and companionship, making sure I was settling in all right. We'd sit in the kitchen where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, and she'd update me on neighborhood news, on mutual friends who were thrilled to hear I was home, on the gossip about David and Claire that was already starting to circulate. People are talking, Martha said one afternoon over tea, about what they did to you, about the nursing home and the house. Linda Morrison saw Claire at the grocery store and gave her the coldest shoulder I've ever witnessed. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. I didn't do this for revenge, Martha. I did it to protect myself. I know that, she said gently, but it doesn't mean you can't enjoy watching karma work. The truth was, I wasn't thinking much about David and Claire at all anymore. They'd stopped calling after the first 2 weeks, had finally accepted that I wasn't going to change my mind or feel guilty about my choices. The silence from them was a relief, actually. Proof that without the promise of money, they had no real interest in maintaining a relationship with me. What I was thinking about was what came next. I was 78 years old, healthy enough despite the heart scare, and I had however many years remained to actually live instead of just exist. The question was how to spend them. I started volunteering at Children's Hope Charity again, returning to the place that had given my life meaning for over 4 decades. The staff welcomed me back like I'd never left, and the children were the same as always. Bright-eyed and struggling and resilient, needing help with homework and someone to listen and just basic kindness that should have been their birthright but somehow wasn't. There was a little girl named Rosa, 7 years old with dark eyes that held too much worry for someone so young. Her mother worked 2 jobs and Rosa came to the after-school program every day, hungry for attention and stability. I started working with her on reading, and she'd curl up next to me on the reading corner couch with a book, her small body relaxing against mine in a way that reminded me of when David and Claire were small, before greed and entitlement had hardened them into strangers. "Miss Margaret," Rosa asked me one day, "do you have grandchildren?" The question hit harder than I expected. "I do," I said carefully, "but I don't see them anymore." "Why not?" How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes families break, that love isn't always enough, that people choose money over relationships? "It's complicated, sweetie, but that's why I'm here with you." She seemed to accept that, snuggling closer with her book, and I felt something shift in my chest. Maybe this was enough. Maybe these children who appreciated my time and attention, who looked at me with genuine affection rather than calculation, maybe they were the family that mattered now. Ellen Morrison pulled me aside after a few weeks back. "Margaret, I wanted to talk to you about something. With your gift, we're planning to expand our mentorship program. We need experienced volunteers to coordinate and train new mentors. I know it's asking a lot, but would you consider taking on a leadership role?" A leadership role. Real responsibility, real purpose, something that mattered beyond just keeping busy until death finally came. "I'd be honored," I said, so I threw myself into it, learning about program development, working with Ellen to create training materials, interviewing potential mentors, and matching them with children who needed guidance. It was challenging work, demanding work, and I loved every minute of it. I was using my brain, contributing something meaningful, making decisions that affected real lives in positive ways. My friend Helen started joining me for volunteer shifts, and together we became something of a team. 2 widows in their 70s, sharp and determined and refusing to be written off as irrelevant just because we'd aged. We had lunch together after our shifts, talking about the children we worked with, about books we'd read, about life and death and everything in between. "You seem different," Helen observed one day. "Lighter somehow. Despite everything with David and Claire." "I am lighter," I said. "I spent so many years carrying their expectations, their needs, their judgment. I didn't realize how heavy it was until I finally put it down." "Any regrets?" I thought about that. About the relationship with my children that was probably beyond repair now, about the grandchildren I'd never really know, about the family gatherings that would never happen. "I regret that they couldn't be different people," I said finally. "I regret that greed mattered more to them than love. But I don't regret protecting myself from that. I don't regret choosing dignity over being exploited." Helen raised her teacup in a mock toast. "To dignity, then. And to lives well lived on our own terms." The house gradually came back to life around me. I hired a gardener to help restore Robert's roses to their former glory. I had the windows professionally cleaned so light flooded every room. I went through closets and drawers, not frantically like David and Claire would have done, but thoughtfully rediscovering treasures I'd forgotten about. Love letters from Robert during our courtship. Baby clothes I'd saved from when the children were small. Photographs spanning 5 decades of a life fully lived. I created a memory wall in the hallway, arranging photographs chronologically. Robert and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful. Baby David, then toddler Claire. Family vacations and birthday parties and ordinary moments that had meant everything. The wall ended around the time Robert got sick, When family photographs became scarce and the distance between me and my children became too great to bridge. Looking at those pictures didn't make me sad. It reminded me that I'd had real love for many years. That I'd been a good mother when my children were young. Had given them everything they needed to become good people. What they'd chosen to become instead wasn't my failure. It was theirs. I started taking walks every morning. Something I'd given up during those depressing weeks at Sunset Meadows. The neighborhood was beautiful in early autumn, leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp and clean. Neighbors I'd known for decades stopped to chat, expressing happiness that I was home, carefully not mentioning the drama with my children even though everyone knew. Mrs. Chun from 3 houses down brought me a casserole. "I heard you were back," she said simply. "Welcome home, Margaret." Such simple kindness, such basic human decency. It wasn't complicated. It didn't come with strings attached or expectations of future payment. Just neighbors caring about neighbors, community supporting community. I joined a book club that met at the library every other Tuesday evening. 8 women ranging from their 50s to their 80s, all sharp and opinionated and wonderfully irreverent. We read everything from literary fiction to mysteries to memoirs, and we didn't hold back in our discussions. It was stimulating and challenging and fun in a way I hadn't experienced in years. One evening, we were discussing a memoir about a woman who'd left an abusive marriage in her 60s and rebuilt her life from nothing. The parallels to my own situation weren't lost on me, even though the specifics were different. "What strikes me," said Patricia, a retired teacher in her 70s, "is how society pressures women to maintain relationships at any cost, even when those relationships are destroying them. We're supposed to forgive endlessly, sacrifice endlessly, accept terrible treatment because family is family. But at what point," I found myself saying, "does that become complicity in our own diminishment? At what point is walking away not betrayal but survival?" The room went quiet. Everyone knew about my situation. News travels fast in small communities, but we hadn't discussed it directly before. "I think you have your answer," Patricia said gently. "You walked away and you survived. More than survived, you're thriving." Was I thriving? I turned that word over in my mind as I walked home that evening under streetlights that cast golden pools on the sidewalk. My children had disowned me, essentially. I'd lost my grandchildren. My family was fractured beyond repair. By conventional measures, I should have been devastated. But I wasn't. I was free. I was purposeful. I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I was making a real difference in children's lives through my work at the charity. I was reading books and taking walks and drinking good coffee and sleeping peacefully in my own bed. Yes, I decided. This was thriving. 3 months after the will reading, I got a letter. Not from David or Claire, they'd maintained their angry silence, but from my granddaughter Emma, David's daughter, who was 19 and away at college. I'd helped pay for her first year before everything fell apart. Back when I still believed my contributions to my children's lives were appreciated rather than expected. The letter was short. She'd heard about what happened from her father, but she wanted to hear my side. She didn't understand all the details, but she remembered me as the grandmother who'd always been kind to her, who'd come to her school plays and helped with homework and genuinely cared. Could we talk? I held that letter for a long time, feeling emotions I'd thought were safely buried. Emma had been sweet as a child, bright and curious and loving. If I responded, I'd be opening a door I'd carefully closed. I'd be risking hurt all over again. But she'd reached out. She'd asked. She deserved honesty at least. I wrote back. I told her the truth, not an angry version, just the facts. About how her father and aunt had treated me, about the nursing home, about why I changed my will, about how love without respect isn't really love at all, and how I'd finally learned to value myself enough to walk away from people who didn't. I told her I'd love to talk to her, but only if she wanted a real relationship with me, not one dictated by what her father wanted or expected. That I was done being used, but my door was open to genuine connection. I mailed the letter and tried not to hope too hard. The charity gala was in November, a fundraiser to celebrate the expansion of programs my gift had made possible. Ellen insisted I attend as guest of honor, and though I tried to decline, she was insistent. So I bought a new dress, dark blue, elegant, nothing like the frumpy, comfortable clothes I'd been wearing at Sunset Meadows. I had my hair done at the salon. I put on the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 40th anniversary. Looking in the mirror that evening, I saw someone I barely recognized. Not the exhausted, defeated woman who'd been driven away from her home 3 months ago. This woman looked strong, confident, alive. The gala was beautiful. The charity had rented a ballroom at the nicest hotel in town, decorated it with thousands of flowers, invited everyone who'd ever supported their work. I walked in on Ellen's arm and felt almost overwhelmed by the warmth of the reception. People I'd worked with for decades came up to hug me, to thank me, to tell me what my gift meant. The children from the after-school program had made a banner that read, "Thank you, Miss Margaret," with handprints and drawings covering every inch. Rosa found me in the crowd and grabbed my hand, pulling me over to show me the banner, pointing out her handprint with pride. "That's mine," she said. "The purple one. Because purple is your favorite color, and you're my favorite person." I knelt down and hugged her, this child who barely knew me but had somehow seen me more clearly than my own children ever had. "You're pretty special yourself, Rosa." The evening included speeches about the charity's work and future plans, about the new programs and expanded services. Ellen talked about legacy and generosity and making a difference. Then she asked me to come to the podium, and before I could protest, the room erupted in applause. I stood there looking out at hundreds of faces, volunteers I'd worked with, families we'd helped, children whose lives had been touched by the charity's work. This was my legacy. This was what mattered. Not money sitting in a bank account, but real impact in real lives. "I'm not much for speeches," I said into the microphone, my voice shaking slightly. "But I want you to know that you've given me as much as I've given you. Purpose, community, a reason to wake up every morning. That's worth more than any dollar amount. Thank you for letting me be part of this beautiful work." More applause, and I stepped down, my eyes damp but my heart full. Walking to my car later that evening, I thought about the journey of the past few months, about hitting rock bottom in that nursing home and finding the strength to climb back out, about standing up to my children and choosing myself, about discovering that life could still hold joy and meaning and purpose, even after everything had fallen apart. I'd lost my children, but I'd found myself. And in the end, that was the trade I'd needed to make. Spring came to Maple Street with an explosion of color that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep this house, this life, this home that held 50 years of memories in every corner. Robert's roses bloomed more beautifully than they had in years, thanks to the gardener the charity had hired to maintain the property. I spent my mornings in the garden with my coffee, watching birds build nests in the oak tree, feeling the warmth of sun on my face, being present in my own life in a way I hadn't been for longer than I cared to admit. It had been 8 months since the will reading, 8 months since I'd seen or spoken to David or Claire, 8 months of silence that had gradually transformed from painful to peaceful, from something I mourned to something I accepted as necessary and right. Emma had responded to my letter. We'd been exchanging emails regularly, and she'd even visited twice during her spring break, sitting in my kitchen asking questions about what had really happened, trying to understand how her family had fractured so completely. I didn't try to turn her against her father, but I didn't lie either. I told her the truth and let her draw her own conclusions. "I think I always knew Dad was obsessed with money," she said during her last visit, stirring sugar into her tea with the same gesture her father used to use when he was young, before greed had hardened him into someone I didn't recognize. "But I didn't realize how bad it was. How he treated you." "I'm so sorry, Grandma. You don't need to apologize for him," I said gently. "His choices are his own, just like yours are your own. You chose to reach out, to hear my side, to maintain a relationship with me even though it probably complicates things with your father. That takes courage." She smiled a little sadly. "He told me I had to choose him or you. I told him that wasn't fair, that you're my grandmother and I love you both. He didn't take it well." My heart ached for her, caught in the middle of a conflict she hadn't created. But I was also proud of her for standing her ground, for refusing to be manipulated into cutting off someone who loved her. Maybe the next generation would be different. Maybe Emma would learn from her father's mistakes rather than repeating them. The work at Children's Hope Charity had become the center of my life. The mentorship program I'd helped develop was thriving, matching caring adults with children who needed guidance and support. Rosa had become my special project, and watching her blossom over the months, Her confidence growing, her reading improving, her smile coming more easily, filled me with a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd felt in years. One afternoon, Rosa's mother Maria came to pick her up from the after-school program and asked if she could speak with me privately. My heart sank, worried something was wrong, but Maria's eyes were bright with tears of gratitude, not sorrow. "I wanted to thank you," she said in her accented English. "Rosa, she talks about you all the time. Miss Margaret this, Miss Margaret that. She wants to read because you read with her. She wants to go to college because you tell her she's smart enough. You've given her hope, Senora. You've given her a future." I hugged this woman I barely knew, this struggling mother working 2 jobs to give her daughter a chance, and I thought about David and Claire, about how they'd had every advantage, every opportunity, and had chosen to become people who valued money over relationship. And here was Rosa with so little, who treated kindness like the precious gift it was. "Rosa gives me hope too," I told Maria. "She reminds me what matters." The charity gala had led to other opportunities. I'd been asked to speak at a regional conference on volunteer program development, to share what had worked in our mentorship initiative. The idea terrified me at first, standing up in front of hundreds of strangers, being seen as an expert on anything. But Ellen encouraged me, and I found myself saying yes, pushing past my comfort zone into territory I'd never imagined exploring at 78 years old. The conference was in a city 2 hours away, and Martha came with me for moral support. We made a weekend of it, staying in a nice hotel, eating at restaurants we'd never tried, laughing like we were young women on an adventure instead of 2 widows in our 70s reclaiming joy wherever we could find it. My presentation went better than I'd dared hope. I talked about meeting people where they are, about the importance of genuine connection over mere obligation, about how the best mentoring relationships benefit both parties equally. People asked questions, took notes, came up afterward to share their own stories and thank me for the insights. "You're a natural," Martha said as we celebrated with wine in our hotel room that evening. Who knew Margaret O'Connor had a public speaking career in her? "Not a career," I laughed, "but maybe a hobby." It felt good, Martha. Sharing what I've learned, helping other programs succeed. It felt purposeful. "That's because it is purposeful," she said. "You've built a whole new life, Liv. Not the life you expected maybe, but a good one. An authentic one." She was right. This wasn't the life I'd imagined when Robert and I were young and planning our future together. I'd thought I'd grow old surrounded by children and grandchildren. That family would be my legacy and my comfort in my final years. I'd thought love and sacrifice would be enough to ensure that my children would stand by me the way I'd always stood by them. I've been wrong about all of that. But in being wrong and having those expectations shattered, I'd discovered something I'd never expected. I was enough all by myself. I didn't need to be useful to be valuable. I didn't need to sacrifice to be worthy of love. I could just be Margaret exactly as I was, and that could be enough. One warm May afternoon, I was working in the garden when a car pulled into my driveway. My heart jumped. I still wasn't used to unexpected visitors, still carried a wariness from those months when David and Claire had made every interaction a battlefield. But the woman who got out of the car was a stranger, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Mrs. O'Connor?" "Margaret. I'm Sarah Chun. I'm a social worker with the foster care system. Ellen Morrison gave me your name. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but I was hoping we could talk." We sat on the porch with lemonade and Sarah explained why she'd come. The foster care system was overwhelmed, she said, and they were looking for volunteers who could provide respite care, temporary housing for children in crisis, just for a few days or weeks until more permanent arrangements could be made. Given my work with the charity and my background raising children, Ellen had suggested I might be interested. "I know it's a lot to consider," Sarah said. "You'd need to go through training and background checks, and there's no pressure at all. But we're desperate for good people, and Ellen speaks so highly of you." I thought about this big house mostly empty except for me, about the spare bedrooms that hadn't seen use in years, about how I'd spent decades caring for children and had discovered through Rosa and the others at the charity how much I still had to give. "Tell me more," I said. The training took 6 weeks. I learned about trauma and attachment, about the specific needs of children in foster care, about regulations and requirements and how to handle emergencies. I was by far the oldest person in the training group, surrounded by couples in their 30s and 40s, but I held my own. Age had brought me something they were still learning: patience, resilience, the understanding that love doesn't always look like what you expect, but it matters just as much. My first placement came in July. A brother and sister, ages 6 and 9, whose mother had been hospitalized and whose father was unknown. They'd be with me for 2 weeks, maybe 3, until their grandmother in another state could arrange to take them. They arrived with nothing but small backpacks and eyes that had seen too much, and my heart broke and opened simultaneously. I gave them the bedrooms that had once belonged to David and Claire, rooms I'd kept exactly as they'd been when my children lived here decades ago. The boy, Marcus, was quiet and watchful. The girl, Keisha, was protective of her brother and suspicious of everything. They'd learned not to trust adults, not to expect kindness to last. "You're really old," Keisha said bluntly that first evening over dinner. "I really am," I agreed, not offended. "Old enough to have learned some things, like how to make the best chocolate chip cookies you've ever tasted. Want to help me bake some tomorrow?" Slowly, cautiously, they began to settle in. Marcus discovered Robert's old collection of model trains in the basement and spent hours carefully setting up the tracks. Keisha helped me in the garden, her small hands gentle with the delicate rose blooms. At night, I read to them the way I'd once read to David and Claire, the way I read to Rosa, and watched them drift off to sleep looking almost peaceful. When their grandmother came to pick them up 3 weeks later, Keisha hugged me tight and whispered, "I wish we could stay. You always have a place in my heart," I told her. "Always." After they left, I stood in the quiet house and cried. Not sad tears exactly, more like tears of recognition, of understanding what I've been looking for all these months. Purpose, connection, a way to pour out the love I had to give in places where it would be received with gratitude rather than entitlement. David called in August, the first time I'd heard from him in 10 months. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Mom." His voice was stiff, formal. "I wanted you to know that Claire and I have been talking. We think we were hasty in cutting you off. Family should stick together, and we'd like to try to rebuild our relationship." I waited, knowing there was more. "We're not asking you to change the will or anything," he continued, the lie transparent in his tone. "We just want our mother back." "What changed?" I asked quietly. 10 months of silence, and suddenly you want your mother back. "What changed, David?" A long pause. Then, "Things have been harder financially than we expected. The nursing home bill, some other expenses. We could use some help, and we thought." "You thought I might give you money if you pretended to care about me," I finished. "You thought wrong. Mom, that's not fair. We do care." "No," I said, surprised by how calm my voice was. "You don't. You care about what I can do for you, what I can give you. That's not the same thing. And I'm done pretending it is. You're really going to do this? Choose strangers over your own children." "I'm not choosing strangers over you, David. I'm choosing people who value me over people who exploit me. There's a difference." I hung up before he could respond, and I blocked his number. Then Claire's, cutting the last threads that connected me to children who'd never really seen me as anything but a resource to be used up and discarded. It hurt. Even knowing it was necessary, even being certain I was making the right choice, it hurt. I grieved all over again for the children they could have been, for the family we might have had if greed hadn't poisoned everything. But I didn't regret it. Not for a second. Fall arrived with its usual burst of color and cool air. I hosted Thanksgiving at my house for the first time in years, filling the dining room table with people who'd become my chosen family. Martha and Helen, Ellen from the charity, Sarah the social worker, Rosa and her mother, Emma who'd driven home from college specifically to spend the holiday with me, and 2 foster children who were staying with me that week. We held hands around the table. This mismatched collection of people who'd found each other through circumstances and choice rather than blood. And I thought about what I was grateful for. Not the life I'd expected, but the life I'd built from the ruins of my expectations. Not the family I'd been born into or created, but the family I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back. "I'm grateful for second chances," I said when it was my turn to share. "For the courage to start over. For people who see you for who you are, not what you can give them. And for learning, even at 78, that it's never too late to choose yourself." Emma squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. I'm grateful for grandmothers who teach you that dignity matters more than approval. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat in Robert's chair by the window and looked out at the garden we'd planted together so many decades ago. I talked to him the way I sometimes did, updating him on my life, on Emma, on the foster children, on everything that had happened since that terrible day when David had driven me away from here. I think you'd be proud, I told him. Not of what happened with David and Claire. That would break your heart the way it broke mine. But of what I did about it. Of how I stood up for myself. Of the life I've built from the ashes. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere upstairs, one of the foster children coughed in their sleep. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, wind rustled through the roses. All the sounds of a house that was loved and lived in and full of purpose. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, sitting in that sterile nursing home room, abandoned and heartbroken, and wondering if this was how my story would end. I thought about the strength it had taken to fight back, to reclaim my life, to choose dignity over being exploited. I thought about everything I'd lost, my children, my grandchildren, except for Emma, the future I'd imagined. But I also thought about everything I'd gained. My home, my independence, my self-respect, a community of people who valued me, children who needed love and had room in their hearts to receive it, purpose that extended beyond being useful to my own family, the freedom to live on my own terms, making my own choices, being fully myself without apology. Was it worth it? That's what people would ask, I supposed. Was standing up to your children, cutting them out of your inheritance, destroying that relationship, was it worth it? Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because the alternative was disappearing completely, erasing myself to serve their greed, spending whatever years I had left making myself smaller so they could feel bigger. The alternative was dying in pieces while I was still alive. This way I got to live. Really live, not just exist. And that was worth everything. I'm 79 now, and I don't know how many years I have left. Could be 1, could be 20. But however many it is, they'll be mine. Spent on people and causes that matter. Spent loving and being loved in return. Spent making a difference in whatever small ways I can. David and Claire will get their $5,000 eventually. They'll stand at my funeral someday, if they come at all, and they'll know that everything else went to children who appreciated it, to programs that changed lives, to a legacy that meant something beyond just passing wealth from one generation to the next. And I'll rest easy knowing that I lived true to my values right up to the very end. That I didn't let greed win. That I chose love over exploitation, dignity over convenience, myself over people who wanted me to disappear. That's my story. That's what I want you to take away from this if you're listening. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. Never too late to walk away from people who diminish you, even if they're family. Never too late to build a life that honors who you are instead of who others need you to be. I'm at peace now. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing you faced a terrible choice and made the right one, even though it cost you everything you thought you couldn't live without. Turns out I could live without them just fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm home. I'm free. I'm myself. And that's more than enough.